Royal Dutch Shell is one of Europe's most illustrious corporate families, associated with industrial might, global reach, and geopolitical influence. Unlike a dynasty of blood, this dynasty was forged in a 1907 alliance between two rival founders, Marcus Samuel, the British Jewish merchant who founded Shell Transport and Trading, and Henri Deterding, the ruthless Dutch industrialist who led Royal Dutch Petroleum. Their origins were remarkably in seashells. The Samuel family imported exotic shells from Asia, but by 1907, this shell company had merged with its Dutch rival to challenge John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, eventually controlling a vast empire of tankers and pipelines. For over a century, the Shell family shaped the energy industry, acting as a pillar of the world-dominating Seven Sisters cartel. Their physical imprint is the iconic pectin logo, recognized globally. Despite their economic power, this family's history is built on a dark and toxic foundation. Their past is marked by bitter controversies, from ruthless colonial exploitation in Indonesia to presiding over an ecological catastrophe in the Niger Delta, the 1995 execution of the Ogoni Nine, and the massive 2011 OPL 245 bribery scandal. How Shell's founders built a Nazi fueling cartel. The founding family, the Samuels, were not oil barons. They were London merchants, outsiders in the British establishment. The patriarch, Marcus Samuel Sr., was a Dutch Jewish immigrant living in the East End of London. In 1833, he founded a small, prosperous business built on the exoticism of the new British Empire. He did not sell commodities, he sold novelties. He imported antiques, lacquerware, and most famously, exotic seashells from the Far East. These shells, used for intricate jewelry boxes and interior design, were a high-margin luxury item. His small shop on a London wharf was simply the Shell Shop. This was the humble, literal origin of the Shell name. When Marcus Sr. died in 1870, he left this trinket business to his two sons, Marcus Samuel Jr. and Samuel Samuel. The sons were not like their father. They were not shopkeepers. They were ambitious, global-minded capitalists. They inherited their father's vast trading network in Asia and the Far East, but they saw a new, black, and far more profitable commodity, kerosene. In the late 19th century, kerosene was the light of the world. It was the fuel of the Second Industrial Revolution, lighting the lamps of every city from London to Tokyo. But the global kerosene market was dominated with absolute monopolistic brutality by one American company, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Rockefeller, as detailed in Ida Tarbell's famous exposé, controlled over 90% of the American oil market. But his true global dominance came from logistics. He had perfected the blue barrel, a standardized 5-gallon oak and iron barrel painted blue. He shipped millions of these barrels, which were expensive, leaky, and dangerous, all over the world. His control of shipping and railroads was so total that no one could compete. Marcus Samuel Jr., the outsider, saw an opportunity to break this monopoly. He, like his father, was a master of the Far East trade. He knew this was Rockefeller's most vulnerable and most profitable market. He just needed two things: a non-Rockefeller source of oil and a cheaper way to transport it. He found the first in the oil fields of the Caspian Sea. He traveled to Baku and saw the vast untapped reserves of Russian oil, an operation financed by another great Jewish banking dynasty, the Rothschilds. In 1891, Marcus Samuel signed a secret, exclusive 9-year contract with the Rothschilds to buy and transport their entire kerosene output. He now had his source completely outside Rockefeller's control. The second part was his true genius: transportation. The blue barrel system was wildly inefficient. The barrels themselves were expensive, they leaked, and they had to be shipped back empty. But more importantly, they were dangerous. The Suez Canal, the vital artery of the British Empire that connected Europe to Asia, forbade most oil ships from passing through. The risk of an explosive barrel starting a fire that could block the canal was too high. This forced Rockefeller's ships to take the long, expensive multi-month journey around the tip of Africa. Marcus Samuel, the merchant, devised an engineering solution. He commissioned a new revolutionary type of ship. It was a bulk tanker. In 1892, his first ship, the Murex, was launched. It was a floating fortress, the first modern oil tanker. Its hull was subdivided into massive tanks. It featured steam-powered pumps, sophisticated ventilation systems, and crucially, a revolutionary method for steam cleaning its own tanks. This meant it was not only safer, but it could carry oil to Asia, and then, after a quick steam clean, carry rice or tea back to Europe, eliminating the empty journey. He personally took the blueprints for the Murex to the Suez Canal authorities. He demonstrated that his ship was safer than any ship on Earth. The authorities, in a move that would change the world, were convinced. They granted the Murex the first ever permit for a bulk oil tanker to pass through the Suez Canal. This single act was a declaration of war. Marcus Samuel had, in one stroke, shattered Rockefeller's global monopoly. The Murex and its sister ships, all named after seashells, like conch and clam, could now deliver Rothschild's Russian oil to the Far East. At a fraction of the cost, Samuel's transport costs were reportedly 40 to 50% lower than standard oils. Rockefeller, with his slow, expensive blue barrels, could not compete. In 1897, Marcus Samuel formally incorporated his new venture, the Shell Transport and Trading Company. They were a dynasty born not of oil production, but of logistics. But while Shell was conquering the seas, a second rival family was rising from the jungles of the Dutch East Indies. In 1890, a group of Dutch capitalists and industrialists in The Hague founded the Royal Dutch Petroleum Company. Their charter and their name was granted by King William III of the Netherlands himself. This was not a new money venture. It was a quasi-state colonial enterprise. Their asset was crude oil, which had been discovered in massive quantities on the island of Sumatra, a Dutch colony. While Shell was a transport company, Royal Dutch was a production company. They were drillers, and their business model was pure 19th century colonial extraction. This was the dark origin of the Dutch side of the dynasty. Their entire operation was built on the exploitation of a colonized people. They operated with the full military and political backing of the Dutch government. They employed cheap, local Indonesian labor to work in the dangerous, remote jungle drilling camps. Historical accounts from the era describe brutal working conditions, high accident rates, and a pay scale that was a fraction of what European workers earned. This was the original sin of the Royal Dutch House, a business model that treated the land and the people of the developing world as expendable resources, a blueprint they would later export with devastating efficiency to Africa and the Middle East. Royal Dutch quickly became a powerful producer with massive oil fields in Sumatra and Borneo. But they were led by a man who would become the Napoleon of oil, a figure who would define the entire 20th century oil industry, Henri de Teerding. De Teerding was a brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless Dutch banker who joined Royal Dutch in 1896 and became its managing director in 1900. He was an organizational genius and a cold-blooded strategist. He looked at the global map and saw two mortal threats. The first and largest was Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which was dumping cheap American oil in Asia, trying to bankrupt Royal Dutch. The second, and more immediate, was Marcus Samuel's Shell Company. Shell and Royal Dutch were locked in a suicidal price war in the Far East. Shell had the cheap transport. Royal Dutch had the cheap production. They were bleeding each other to death. D. Turding knew this was madness. He knew that a war between the two outsider companies would only allow Rockefeller to pick off the winner. His solution was not war, it was amalgamation. He began to pursue Marcus Samuel. Samuel, the proud British founder, was initially resistant, but Rockefeller's counterattacks were brutal. Standard Oil was flooding the market, and Shell's profits were evaporating. Samuel, facing financial ruin, was finally forced to the table. In 1907, after years of bitter, complex negotiations, the two families agreed to merge. The new entity was the Royal Dutch Shell Group. It was not a simple merger. It was a complex dynastic marriage designed to preserve the power and tax advantages of both houses. The new group would be owned 60% by the Dutch royal side and 40% by the British Shell side. It would have two parent companies, two headquarters, and two chairmen. But it would have only one managing director, one true emperor, with total operational control of the global empire. And that man was Henri de Turding. The 60-40 split was a humiliation for Marcus Samuel, who had been outmaneuvered by the brilliant Dutchman. But it was a stroke of genius for the company. The new Royal Dutch Shell was instantly the only corporation on earth that could compete directly with Standard Oil. It had its own massive production and its own world-class global shipping fleet. By 1910, this new alliance controlled over 10% of the global oil market and was perfectly positioned to expand. But this new dynasty was, from its birth, built on a toxic foundation. It had combined the colonial exploitation model of the Dutch with the ruthless, anti-competitive logistics model of the British, and it was now led by a man, Henri de Turding, whose own dark past would come to define the company's amoral political compass. While Marcus Samuel's original genius was transportation, de Turding's was consolidation and exploration. He immediately pushed the dynasty's operations beyond its strongholds in the Far East. He saw that the 20th century would be defined by the internal combustion engine, and he intended to fuel it. His first target was Russia. Even before the merger was finalized, de Turding, using Royal Dutch's massive capital, had moved to consolidate the chaotic post-Rothschild oil fields of Baku. He bought up smaller producers, creating a dominant position. His next target was America itself. He knew he could not beat Rockefeller on his home turf of Pennsylvania or Ohio. So, he went where the new oil was being found, the lawless, booming fields of Oklahoma and Texas. In 1912, he founded the Roxana Petroleum Company in Oklahoma, which would eventually, in 1949, be renamed Shell Oil Company. This was a direct, audacious invasion of Rockefeller's home continent, and in 1913, he made one of his most lucrative moves, one that would mirror the colonial exploitation of his Dutch ancestors. He plunged the company's resources into Venezuela. He acquired the Caribbean Petroleum Company, which held vast, untapped concessions. Venezuela, ruled by a succession of corrupt dictators, was the perfect partner. It had all the oil, and it was willing to trade it for a fraction of its value. The Shell dynasty's subsequent operations in Venezuela, particularly around Lake Maracaibo, would become one of its greatest cash cows and a source of profound environmental and social controversy, a first draft for what was to come in Nigeria. But de Turding's greatest triumph, the event that truly forged the Shell dynasty's power, was not one of his own making. It was a gift delivered by the U.S. government. On May 15, 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the landmark case Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus United States, ruled that John D. Rockefeller's empire was an illegal monopoly in restraint of trade and violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The court ordered that Standard Oil be shattered into 34 separate, independent companies. For Henri de Terding, this was the single greatest event of his life. His only true global rival, the dragon he had spent his entire career fighting, had just been slain for him by its own government. The breakup of Standard Oil created a global power vacuum. The 34 new baby standards were forced to compete with each other, their integration broken, their global network in chaos deterring, at the head of his single vast vertically integrated global entity, pounced. Vertical integration was the dynasty's core business strategy. While the baby standards were now fragmented, one company owning the wells, another the pipelines, another the refineries, Royal Dutch Shell owned everything. They owned the exploration teams that found the oil in the jungles of Borneo and Venezuela. And, increasingly, they owned the gasoline stations in cities from London to Shanghai. Marked by the iconic red and yellow pectin Shell logo, this was a closed loop. Shell could control the price and the profit at every single step, from the ground to the gas tank. This model, which Rockefeller had pioneered and the U.S. government had just destroyed, was now Shell's unique global weapon. With Standard Oil shattered, de Terding now moved to ensure that no such free market chaos would ever challenge him again. He would not just build an empire, he would build a cartel. His golden age was the 1910s and 1920s. He became the architect of the new global oil order. This dark past of the dynasty was not one of competition. It was one of collusion. The first front was political. De Terding understood that oil was not a commodity. It was an instrument of geopolitical power. He moved to make his dynasty indispensable to the British Empire. In 1914, as World War I was about to erupt, the British Royal Navy, under First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, was making a terrifying strategic pivot, converting its entire fleet from coal to oil. This created a national security crisis. Britain had vast reserves of Welsh coal. It had no oil. It was, in a single stroke, making its entire navy, and thus its entire empire, dependent on foreign oil. Churchill's solution was to buy a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, securing access to the new fields in Iran. But Anglo-Persian was not yet a giant. The other great British domiciled firm was Shell. De Terding, who had become a naturalized British subject and been knighted for his services, positioned his British half as a patriotic partner. He effectively lobbied the British government, ensuring that his dynasty would be a primary and trusted supplier to the Royal Navy. He was locking in the most powerful military customer on earth. His second and more secret act of collusion was with his rivals. The old world of Standard Oil was gone. The new world would be run by a committee of kings. This committee would become known as the Seven Sisters, the seven great oil companies that, for the next 50 years, would control the world's oil supply. They were Shell, BP, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf, and Texaco. Henri de Terding was the unofficial chairman of this new global cartel. The most famous and most audacious example of this collusion was the battle for the Middle East. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered and its oil-rich provinces were seized by the British and French. De Terding, along with the heads of the other sisters, knew that a price war over these new fields would destroy their profits. His solution was to eliminate competition entirely. In 1928, after years of complex secret negotiations, Duterte and his rivals met. They formed a joint venture, the Iraq Petroleum Company, to collectively manage the entire oil production of Iraq Shell, BP, and the American firms all took a share. They had created a monopoly. To formalize this, they allegedly held a famous meeting. According to legend, one of the partners, Calouste Gulbenkian, took a red pencil and drew a line on a map of the now defunct Ottoman Empire. This red line agreement was a gentleman's pact. The sisters who were part of the IPC agreed that they would not compete with each other inside that red line, which covered almost the entire known oil-rich Middle East. This was the Severin-level abuse of power. It was a secret, illegal cartel of the world's most powerful corporations, dividing up the resources of an entire continent, fixing the price and ensuring that no outsider could ever challenge them. This was the governance scandal that defined the Severin dynasty's rise. Their entire global empire was built not on free market competition, but on a foundation of collusion, cartels, and colonial exploitation. This was the dynasty that Sir Henry Duterte, the Napoleon of oil, had built by the 1930s. He was at his peak. He was one of the richest men in the world, an autocrat who ruled a global empire of tankers, wells, and refineries. He was more powerful than most nations. Duterte was not just a capitalist. He was a political ideologue. He was a rabid, obsessive anti-communist. He had seen his firm's new oil fields in Russia seized by the Bolsheviks after the 1917 revolution. This loss radicalized him. He became convinced that Bolshevism was a global plague that must be destroyed at all costs. This obsession led him, in the 1930s, to a fatal conclusion. He began to see Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party as the great bulwark against the Soviet threat. In 1934, Duterte, then one of the most powerful men in the world, personally met with Hitler. He began to use Royal Dutch Shell's vast resources to support the Nazi regime. He sold massive quantities of oil to Germany on favorable credit terms, allowing Hitler to fuel the rearmament of his air force and his tank divisions. This was not a secret, it was a public scandal. The Shell name, which had been founded by the Jewish Samuel family, was now being used to fuel the rise of the Third Reich. The Samuel family, who were still 40% owners, were horrified. The Jewish Chronicle and other organizations began to call for a global boycott of Shell. The company was plunged into a moral and public relations crisis. The board, terrified of the backlash, finally forced Duterte out. In 1937, the Napoleon of oil was pushed into retirement. He died in Germany just 2 years later in 1939, a disgraced pro-Nazi outcast. Just months before the war he had helped make possible began. This was the original sin of the unified Shell dynasty. The company had been founded on colonial exploitation in Indonesia. It had been built by a man who was willing to do business with the Nazis to fight his own ideological wars. The new generation of managers who took over during World War II had learned this lesson well. The company, like its Swiss rival Nestlé, played both sides. It was a crucial supplier of fuel to the Allies, but its subsidiaries in German-occupied territory continued to operate, fueling the Nazi war machine. The dynasty's core philosophy was now set in stone: profit, pragmatism, and political influence above all else. The state was a partner, the earth was a resource, and morality was a luxury. It was this perfected amoral DNA that the company would carry into the post-war era as it began its fateful expansion into a new, unstable, and oil-rich territory, the Niger Delta. Why did this $100 billion company need a nonviolent poet to die? The Royal Dutch Shell dynasty, forged by the pro-Nazi pragmatism of Henri de Terding and the colonial exploitation of Indonesia, entered the post-World War II era as a global colossus. The Seven Sisters cartel, which Shell had helped architect, was in full control of the world's oil supply. The company's dual-headed leadership in London and The Hague, now run by a new faceless generation of professional managers, had perfected the art of quiet power. They had learned from de Terding's fall. Their new strategy was to be publicly apolitical, while privately embedding themselves with any government, democratic or despotic, that could guarantee them access to crude. Their grandest, most profitable, and most catastrophic partnership was with the nation of Nigeria. In 1956, just before Nigeria's independence, Shell BP struck oil at Oloibiri in the Niger Delta. The discovery was not just a new oil field, it was a new paradigm. The Niger Delta was a vast 40,000 square kilometer wetland, a delicate, complex ecosystem of mangrove forests, rivers, and creeks that was home to over 30 million people from dozens of distinct ethnic groups. For centuries, these peoples, like the Ogoni, had lived as subsistence fishermen and farmers, their entire culture and livelihood dependent on the clean water and fertile land. Shell's arrival was an alien invasion, and they brought with them the same colonial business model they had perfected in Indonesia: maximum extraction for minimum cost. They formed a joint venture, the Shell Petroleum Development Company, in which the Nigerian state, through the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, or NNPC, was the majority partner. This was a brilliant, cynical strategy. It was not Shell operating in Nigeria, it was Nigeria itself. This structure gave Shell a political shield. Their partner in profit was the government. This meant that any attack on Shell's operations, any protest, any lawsuit, any demand for cleanup was not an attack on a corporation. It was an act of sedition against the state. The oil boom of the 1970s, fueled by the OPEC crisis, turned Nigeria into one of the world's most important producers, and Shell was its king. By the 1980s, the SPDC, operated by Shell, was pumping nearly 1 million barrels of oil a day, accounting for over 50% of Nigeria's entire oil production. The Shell dynasty and the corrupt military dictatorships that ran Nigeria grew fantastically rich. The Nigerian people did not. The curse of oil was not just a metaphor, it was a physical reality. The Niger Delta, the homeland of the Ogoni and other tribes, was being systematically poisoned on an industrial scale. This was not the result of a single Exxon Valdez-style accident. It was the result of a deliberate, decades-long business decision to prioritize profit over safety. Shell's infrastructure in the Delta was, by the 1970s, already aging. The pipelines that crisscrossed the region, running directly through villages, farms, and rivers, were corroding, rusting, and poorly maintained. Instead of investing billions to replace and modernize this network, Shell's managers in London and The Hague made a simple cold calculation. It was cheaper to let them spill, and they spilled constantly. The United Nations Environmental Program, in a 2011 report, would later provide the horrifying statistics. They found that from 1976 to 1991 alone, Shell's operations in the Niger Delta had spilled an average of 16,000 metric tons of crude oil per year. To put that in perspective, the Exxon Valdez disaster, which shocked the world, was a single spill of 37,000 tons. The Shell dynasty was, in effect, perpetrating an Exxon Valdez every 2 years for 30 years. This was a slow-motion ecocide. The 40,000 square kilometers of the Delta one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, were transformed into a toxic black land. The mangrove forests, vital nurseries for fish, were choked and killed. The farmland was poisoned, its soil saturated with crude. The rivers and creeks, the only source of drinking water for 30 million people, became rainbows of petrochemical sheen. For the Ogoni people, this was not an environmental issue. It was an extinction event. They were fishermen with no fish. They were farmers with no crops. They were people with no clean water. Studies by the World Health Organization and later human rights groups would link this pervasive pollution to soaring rates of cancer, skin diseases, respiratory illnesses, and infant mortality. For decades, the Ogoni people's complaints were ignored. Shell's official response was to blame the victims. The company's PR department consistently and often falsely claimed that the vast majority of the spills were not due to their own corroding, poorly maintained pipelines, but to sabotage and theft by the local population. By 1990, the Ogoni people had had enough, and they found their voice in one of the most compelling and charismatic leaders of the 20th century, Ken Saro-Wiwa. Saro-Wiwa was not a militant. He was an intellectual. He was a celebrated author, a poet, and the creator of Nigeria's most popular television sitcom. He was a wealthy, sophisticated man who had for a time served in the government. He was, in other words, the one man the Shell dynasty could not dismiss as an uneducated saboteur. In 1990, Saro-Wiwa and other Ogoni leaders founded the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people. Their platform, the Ogoni Bill of Rights, was not a radical call for revolution. It was a simple, desperate, capitalist demand. It stated that the Ogoni people, on whose land Shell had extracted an estimated $30 billion of oil, had received nothing in return. No schools, no hospitals, no electricity, no clean water, and had in fact been left with only a poisoned landscape. Mossop demanded two things: $10 billion in damages and royalties, and that Shell clean up its mess. Saro-Wiwa was a brilliant organizer. He adopted a strategy of mass nonviolent resistance. He knew he could not defeat the Nigerian army, but he could and would shame the white man. He organized hundreds of thousands of Ogoni people. In January 1993, 300,000 Ogonis, a full two-thirds of their entire population, marched peacefully, holding signs that read, "Shell is hell." The protests were a stunning success. They were so massive, so total, that Shell's operations in Ogoniland were brought to a complete standstill. In 1993, in a move that stunned the company, Shell officially fled Ogoniland. They demanned their flow stations and ceased all production. This was a declaration of war. Shell, the $100 billion global giant, had been defeated, humiliated, and chased away by a nonviolent poet and his army of unarmed farmers. The dynasty's response was to unleash its partner. Shell could not, as a multinational corporation, send in its own army, but its joint venture partner, the Nigerian government, could, and the government at the time was the brutal, corrupt, and paranoid military dictatorship of General Sani Abacha. Abacha's regime, which was almost entirely dependent on Shell's oil revenues, now had a Shell problem. Mossop was not just a threat to the company, it was a threat to the state's income. What happened next became the subject of a massive 13-year legal battle, Wiwa v. Shell, filed in the United States by the Center for Constitutional Rights on behalf of the victims' families. The lawsuit, based on internal company documents, eyewitness testimony, and whistleblower accounts, alleged that the Shell dynasty was not a passive, neutral observer in the violence that followed. It alleged that Shell was actively complicit in a campaign of state-sponsored terror. The allegations were chilling. The lawsuit claimed Shell provided logistical and financial support to the Nigerian military and its notoriously brutal Internal Security Task Force, a unit nicknamed the Kill and Go Police. Witnesses testified that Shell provided vehicles that were used by this unit to raid Ogoni villages. Internal memos revealed that Shell shared reports on Mosapi and the subversive activities of Ken Saro-Wiwa with the military government, effectively painting a target on his back. It was even alleged that Shell's Nigerian managers met with military leaders to discuss strategies for dealing with the Ogoni problem. Shell has, for decades, denied all of these allegations. The company's official position has always been that it was merely a neutral business, stuck in the middle of a tragic internal political dispute. But the results on the ground were undeniable. In 1993 and 1994, the Nigerian military, allegedly supported by Shell, unleashed a campaign of terror against the Ogoni people. According to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, this campaign was not a police action. It was a scorched earth operation. Soldiers swept through Ogoniland, burning villages, systematically raping women, and summarily executing Mosapi supporters. A 1999 Human Rights Watch report estimated that over 2,000 Ogoni were killed in this crackdown. Then, in May 1994, the Abacha regime found its pretext a group of 4 conservative Ogoni chiefs who were seen as pro-Shell were murdered by a mob of Ogoni youth. The circumstances were, and remain, mysterious. Ken Saro-Wiwa was not even in the village at the time. He was actively campaigning against violence. The Abacha government, however, did not care. They immediately arrested Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Mosop leaders. The Ogoni 9, as they became known, were charged with inciting the murders. The trial that followed, held before a secret special military tribunal, was a farce. It was a show trial. The prosecution's witnesses were later proven to have been bribed by the government, with witnesses later testifying in the U.S. lawsuit that Shell representatives had been present when these bribes were offered. The international community was outraged. Amnesty International declared the Ogoni 9 prisoners of conscience. The world knew this was a political assassination, a judicial murder. This was the Shell dynasty's critical moment. The company, and only the company, had the power to stop it. The Abacha regime was a pariah state, and Shell's oil revenue was its only lifeline. A single public statement from Shell's board in London, a threat to review its operations or halt production, unless Saro-Wiwa was given a fair civilian trial, would have almost certainly saved his life. The world waited. Human rights groups, the Pope, the British government, and the U.S. State Department all pleaded with Shell's leadership to intervene. The Shell dynasty, led by its board, did nothing. Their response was a chilling masterpiece of corporate speak. They issued a statement saying they would not interfere in the sovereign legal processes of a nation. They claimed that quiet diplomacy was the only way this silence was in the eyes of the world, active complicity. Shell, which had allegedly provided the vehicles that terrorized the Ogoni, was now providing the political cover that would allow their leader to be hanged on November 10th, 1995. Ken Saro-Wiwa and the 8 other Mosop leaders were hanged by the neck by the Nigerian military government. The execution was reportedly botched. Saro-Wiwa had to be hanged 5 times before he died. His reported last words, as he was led to the gallows, were a direct curse on his executioners. "Lord, take my soul, but the struggle continues." The Shell curse was now literal. The Royal Dutch name, a symbol of European industry, was now, in the global press, the face of a corporate executioner. The international outrage was instantaneous and total Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth. Shell was, for the first time, a global pariah. Greenpeace and Amnesty International launched a global boycott of Shell products. Boycott Shell became the rallying cry of the new rising anti-globalization movement. The Financial Times reported a 5% drop in sales in Europe as consumers abandoned the brand in disgust. The Shell dynasty was shattered. The Shell name, born from a peaceful Victorian seashell, was now synonymous with corporate murder, ecocide, and a dead poet. The company's family response was a slow, decades-long, multi-billion-dollar damage control operation. In 2009, after 13 years of legal warfare, Shell finally agreed to settle the Wiwa v. Shell lawsuit out of court. They paid $15.5 million to the families of the Ogoni Nine. But in a classic cynical legal move, the settlement included no admission of responsibility. The money was a humanitarian gesture, they claimed, not a confession. Simultaneously, they ramped up their philanthropy. The Shell Nigeria Community Development Fund, which had existed for years, became a high-profile $100 million a year PR machine, building schools, hospitals, and water projects. But critics, including Amnesty, dismissed this as blood money, a cynical attempt to greenwash a legacy of murder and buy the silence of a new generation. The legal battles, however, did not stop. In 2021, in a landmark historic ruling, a Dutch court in The Hague finally broke the Shell dynasty's legal firewall. The court ruled in favor of 4 Nigerian farmers, finding that Royal Dutch Shell was responsible for the pollution caused by its Nigerian subsidiary, SPDC. They were ordered to pay compensation and, for the first time, to clean up their mess. This 2021 verdict was the legal earthquake. It confirmed what Saro-Wiwa had died for, that the dynasty in its palaces in London and The Hague was responsible for the hell it had created in the Niger Delta. The curse had finally legally come home, the $1.1 billion bribe and the great escape. The 1995 execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa was the moment the Royal Dutch Shell dynasty lost its mask. The quiet power, the civilized aristocratic veneer of the 6th great power of Europe had been ripped away, revealing the brutal colonial machinery beneath the murder of the Ogoni Nine and Shell's alleged complicity in the military terror campaign that preceded it was not, as the company claimed, a tragic political event they were stuck in the middle of. It was, as critics argued, the cost of doing business. It was the price the dynasty was willing to pay to protect its 1 million barrel a day oil flow from the Niger Delta, the $15.5 million settlement. Shell later paid to the victims' families without admitting guilt was seen by many as nothing more than a blood money transaction, a rounding error on a balance sheet that had profited billions from the Ogoni's land. But the Ogoni tragedy, while the most visible of the dynasty's crimes, was just one symptom of a much deeper, more systemic disease. The Shell curse in Nigeria was not a single event. It was a decades-long business model built on 2 pillars: industrial-scale pollution and state-level corruption. While the world was focused on the drama of the Ogoni Nine, Shell was engaged in a parallel and perhaps even larger scandal that exposed the true rotten core of its African operations, the OPL 245 bribery case. This was not a story of violence, but of pure, high-finance corruption. The prize was Oil Prospecting License 245, or OPL 245. This was one of the richest, most valuable untapped oil blocks in all of Africa, located off the Nigerian coast. It was a whale field, estimated to hold over 9 billion barrels of crude. The story, as pieced together by investigative journalists from Global Witness and later by Italian prosecutors, was a tale of breathtaking cynicism. In 1998, the corrupt military dictator Sani Abacha awarded the rights to this multi-billion-dollar oil block to a dummy company, Malabu Oil and Gas. The price? Just $20 million. It was later revealed that Malabu Oil and Gas was not a real company. It was a shell corporation secretly controlled by Dan Atete, who was, at the time, Sani Abacha's oil minister. He had, in effect, simply given the richest oil block in Africa to himself. When Abacha died, the deal was disputed and the OPL 245 block was trapped in a legal web. By 2011, Shell, along with its Italian rival partner Eni, wanted that block. They needed it, and they were willing to pay. The two dynasties, Shell and Eni, devised a plan they would, on paper, pay the Nigerian government for the rights to the block. In 2011, Shell and Eni transferred $1.3 billion to the Nigerian government. It was a massive state-level deal. But then, in a move that prosecutors would later call a conspiracy, the Nigerian government, acting as a laundering agent, immediately transferred $1.1 billion of that same money to the private, offshore accounts of Malabu Oil and Gas, the Shell company still controlled by the now former oil minister Dan Atete. The Shell dynasty had not bought an oil field from Nigeria. It had, as Global Witness alleged, knowingly participated in a $1.1 billion bribe, a massive payoff to a corrupt former official to secure a prized asset. This was the Shell system in its purest form. It was not the clumsy violence of the Ogoni crackdown. It was the sophisticated, quiet, and legalistic corruption of the boardroom. The scandal exploded. In 2017, Italian prosecutors in Milan put Shell, Eni, and a roster of their top executives on trial for international bribery and corruption. The trial lasted for years, a deep, granular investigation into the dynasty's inner workings. In 2021, in a stunning verdict, the Italian court acquitted all the executives. The judges ruled that while the deal was opaque and the payment to Atete was ethically questionable, prosecutors had not proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Shell and any executives knew the $1.1 billion was a bribe. The dynasty had once again won. Its army of lawyers, its corporate structure, had shielded it, but the win was hollow. The trial had exposed the company's entire rotten methodology to the world. The U.S. Department of Justice in 2021 fined Shell $48 million for its role in a different but related Nigerian bribery scheme. In 2022, the UK's Serious Fraud Office hit Shell with a $30 million fine for corrupt payments in Angola. The OPL 245 case was not an exception, it was the rule. The dynasty's family business in Africa, critics alleged, was built on a foundation of systemic bribery, a cost of doing business that they simply factored into their profit and loss statements. While this financial corruption was being exposed in the courts of Milan, the environmental corruption in the Niger Delta was metastasizing. The 2011 UNEP report, the UN's official autopsy of Ogoniland after Shell's departure, was a document of pure horror. It confirmed everything Ken Saro-Wiwa had been hanged for saying. The UN found that the pollution was not just a few spills from sabotage. It was systemic, pervasive, and catastrophic. They found that the groundwater, the only source of drinking water for thousands of Ogoni, was contaminated with hydrocarbons at levels 900 times higher than WHO safe drinking standards. The report concluded that a full environmental restoration of Ogoniland would be the largest such project ever attempted, requiring 30 years and an initial immediate investment of $1 billion just to start. The 2021 Dutch court ruling had for the first time made the parent company in The Hague legally responsible for this mess. The Shell dynasty was now cornered. They were facing billions in legal claims over the Ogoni 9, billions in potential fines from the OPL 245 scandal, and now a $100 billion plus liability to clean up the 60 years of pollution in the Delta. The dynasty, true to its pragmatic, amoral roots, responded not with remorse but with a new strategy, the Great Escape. In 2024, Shell announced it was selling its entire onshore Nigerian subsidiary, the SPDC. It was selling the pipelines, the wells, the flow stations, and crucially, all the legal and environmental liability to a consortium of smaller local companies for a mere $2.4 billion. This was the final cynical act of the Shell curse. The company that had extracted tens, perhaps hundreds, of billions of dollars in profit from the Niger Delta for over 60 years was now running away, as Amnesty International stated, from the $100 billion plus cleanup bill. They were divesting. They were keeping the profits, but selling the poison. They were leaving the 30 million people of the Niger Delta in a toxic wasteland, now owned by a new, smaller company that had neither the resources nor the obligation to clean it up. It was perhaps the single most brilliant and most evil business deal in their 500-year history. This, then, was the governance scandal of the Gin Shell. It was not just a single lapse like Ken Saro-Wiwa or a single bribe like OPL 245. It was a multi-generational corporate strategy of systemic exploitation. It was the abuse of the environment, spilling the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez every few years, and then faking the cleanups. As a 2024 BBC investigation alleged, it was the abuse of the local population, where, according to the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, cancer rates in the Delta have soared by 40%. It was the abuse of the economy where, according to the World Bank, the poverty rate in the oil-rich Delta has increased by 50% as Shell's operations and its corrupt government partners siphoned all the wealth away. The dynasty of professional managers in London and The Hague had perfected the art of quiet power. They had no mad emperors like the Claudii, no criminal kings like Michael Milken. They were worse. They were a faceless, nameless, amoral bureaucracy, a family firm whose only family value was the bottom line. And their victims were not just a few investors or a single murdered activist. Their victims were an entire nation and an entire ecosystem left permanently poisoned so that the Shell dynasty could continue to fuel the world, a dynasty's personal and public disintegration. The Royal Dutch Shell dynasty was never a family of blood. It was a dynasty of managers, a corporate family built on a 1907 pact between the British Samuels and the Dutch royal house. This meant the dynasty's personal tragedies were not the stuff of tabloids, no lurid divorces, no children lost in comas, no heirs fighting over a will. The family was the corporation, and its tragedies were public, corporate, and in the end, existential. They were the stories of the men who inherited the title of CEO, the patriarchs who were forced to answer for the sins of their forefathers, a curse passed down from one generation of executives to the next. The first of these personal tragedies was that of the dynasty's true founder, Sir Henry Deterding. He was the Napoleon of oil, the man who had built the global empire. But his end was not a glorious retirement. It was a disgraceful, self-inflicted exile. As detailed earlier, Deterding in his later years had become consumed by a paranoid hatred of communism. This obsession led him directly into the arms of the Nazi Party. In the 1930s, he had met with Adolf Hitler and had, in his capacity as the head of Royal Dutch Shell, begun to supply the Third Reich with oil on favorable credit terms, personally fueling the rearmament of the German war machine. This was the dynasty's first great internal dispute. It was a moral and political civil war. The Samuel family, the Jewish British founders, who still controlled the 40% Shell stake, were horrified. Their family's name, their company, was being used to arm the most anti-Semitic regime in human history. They, along with the other British directors, fought him. The backlash was intense. A global boycott of Shell was called by Jewish organizations. Deterring the autocrat who had ruled the firm for 30 years had become a toxic liability. In 1937, the board finally forced him out. He was pushed into retirement. His personal tragedy was that he was the company, and the company had rejected him. He died in 1939 in disgrace at his estate in Germany, just months before the war he had helped make possible began. He was the first king of the dynasty to be deposed by his own family, a public humiliation that set the precedent for the modern era. For the next half-century, the dynasty was run by a faceless, anonymous committee of managers. They had no personalities. They were shellmen, protected by the corporate veil. But the Ogoni 9 tragedy in 1995 changed everything. The execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the global boycott that followed made the company's anonymity impossible. The public needed a face to hate. And from that moment on, the CEO of Shell was no longer just a manager. He was the public target, the man forced to personally answer for the dynasty's curse. This was the personal tragedy inherited by Ben van Beurden, the Dutch CEO who ran Shell from 2014 to 2023. He was not a robber baron. He was a polished, modern executive. But he was the man on the throne when the bill for 60 years of pollution and corruption came due. His reign was defined by a constant, brutal, and deeply personal public assault. The respect his predecessors had enjoyed was gone. He was the target of the new global climate change movement. The sins of the Niger Delta had now merged with the larger existential sin of Shell's role in causing the climate crisis. This new war was not fought with lawsuits alone. It was fought with humiliation. At the 2019 annual general meeting, a traditional stuffy corporate event, Van Beurden was met with a full-scale protest. Activists from Greenpeace and other groups stormed the building. They did not just picket, they threw paint, they unfurled banners, they glued themselves to the doors, they screamed at the executives, calling them climate criminals. Ben van Beurden, the multi-millionaire CEO, was forced to sit there, his face a mask of fury, as activists called him a monster. This was the new personal tragedy of the Shell dynasty. The king was no longer a revered, untouchable figure. He was a public villain, a man who could be pelted with paint and insults, just as the Emperor Vespasian had been pelted with turnips. But the real threat was no longer just from the mob outside. It was coming from the family inside. The internal disputes that tore the dynasty apart in the 21st century were not about morality. They were about money. The company's shareholders, the cousins and relatives of this corporate family, were in open revolt. In 2021, the activist investor fund Third Point, led by the notorious Daniel Loeb, took a massive stake in Shell. Loeb was not an environmentalist. He was a capitalist. And he saw that Shell was a dysfunctional legacy asset, much like the old money firm, Kuhn. Loeb had been Loeb's argument, laid out in a public letter, was that Shell was trying to be two companies at once and failing at both. It was the dirty legacy oil and gas company and a new, clean, renewable energy company. He demanded that Shell break itself up. He argued that the company should be split in two, separating the dirty from the clean. This, he argued, was the only way to unlock shareholder value. This was a profound dynastic civil war. The family was now at war with itself, arguing that its entire diversified Seven Sisters model was obsolete. The internal dispute was no longer about a pro-Nazi CEO. It was about the very existence of the 114-year-old company. While Van Beurden was fighting off the investors, he was also losing in the courts. The 2021 Dutch court ruling, which found the parent company in The Hague legally responsible for the Nigerian pollution, was a legal earthquake. But a second, even more devastating legal bomb had landed. In 2021, a Dutch court, in a landmark case brought by the environmental group Client Earth, ordered Royal Dutch Shell to cut its global carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. This was not a fine. This was a judge telling the dynasty how to run its business. It was an existential threat. The court had, in effect, declared Shell's entire 100-year-old business model, find oil, pump oil, sell oil, to be illegal. This set the stage for the dynasty's final and most humiliating disintegration. The company was under assault from all sides. Its public image was destroyed by the Ogoni legacy. Its shareholders were in open revolt. Its legal foundations were crumbling under the Dutch court rulings, and its new CEO, Wael Sawan, immediately inherited a new personal lawsuit from Client Earth, this time suing the directors personally for failing to manage the climate risk. The dynasty, cornered and bleeding, made a final desperate move. They decided to erase their own identity. In January 2022, the company announced it was abandoning its 115-year-old dual-headed family structure. It would no longer be Royal Dutch Shell, a company of two nations, headquartered in both London and The Hague. It would abandon Royal Dutch. It would flee The Hague, the very city where Henri de Terding had built his empire. It would consolidate its entire operation in London and rename itself simply Shell plc. This was not a simple corporate simplification. As the company's PR team claimed, this was a surrender. It was a total symbolic disintegration of the family. The Royal Dutch name, which had once signified the dynasty's noble heritage and its protection from the Dutch crown, was now a toxic liability. It was the name that had been defeated in a Dutch court by Nigerian farmers. Fleeing The Hague was an act of legal desperation, an attempt to get out of the jurisdiction that had dared to hold them accountable. The Shell name, the legacy of the Jewish-British Samuel family, was all that remained. But this name, too, was cursed. It was the name that the Ogoni had chanted, Shell is hell. The dynasty, in a final cynical act, had disintegrated itself. It had killed its own Royal Dutch half, abandoned its Dutch home, and become a single streamlined British entity, hoping that by changing its name and its address, it could escape its own past. This was the family's ultimate response to the personal tragedies of its leaders. When Henri de Terding was disgraced, he was retired. When Ben Van Beurden was humiliated by protesters and defeated in court, the company itself retired its own identity. But this corporate shell game was paired with its other classic family response, philanthropy. The dynasty had always used its charitable arms to wash its reputation. The Shell Foundation, established in 2000, was the modern, sophisticated version of this. It spends $50 million a year on good works, primarily funding sustainable energy and development projects in Africa and Asia. This is the final perfect irony of the Shell curse. The corporate arm of the dynasty, Shell plc, spends its billions bribing officials in Nigeria and polluting the Niger Delta. And then, The charitable arm of the dynasty, the Shell Foundation, spends its millions giving aid to the very same poor African communities that the corporate side has just exploited. The disintegration of the family was not a death. It was a rebranding. They had sold their Nigerian liability to a smaller company, washing their hands of the $100 billion cleanup. They had erased their Royal Dutch name to flee the Dutch courts, and they had polished their charitable foundation to cover the whole operation in a green sheen. The family was and is a machine. It feels no guilt. It has no tragedy. It just has a balance sheet. It has adapted, shed its old skin, and continues, as it has for 120 years, to profit from the killer inventions and the dark extraction that defined its founders, leaving a legacy of social and environmental ruin in its wake. The final verdict on a 120-year crime. The Royal Dutch Shell dynasty, a corporate family built on a 1907 pact, was a machine designed for one purpose: to find, extract, and profit from oil. But this simple industrial goal was, from its inception, entangled with a darker, more complex mission: the exercise of geopolitical power. The Shell curse, as critics call it, is not just about environmental spills. It is about the dynasty's century-long history of operating as a shadow state, a corporate empire that allegedly toppled governments, bribed officials, and used its vast wealth to silence its enemies. This is the dark past that has led to a web of persistent conspiracy theories. These are not just the whispers of internet forums. They are the formal allegations in courtrooms, the conclusions of investigative journalists, and the deep suspicions of entire nations. The central question of the Shell legacy is not, did they pollute? That is a proven, quantifiable fact. The question is, are they just a corporation, or are they a criminal enterprise? The most potent and damning conspiracy is the one that is most plausible: that Shell did not just allow Ken Saro-Wiwa to be killed, they actively orchestrated it. The official family narrative, the one Shell has maintained in court for 30 years, is that they were a neutral party. They were a simple commercial enterprise, stuck in the middle of a tragic internal political dispute between the Ogoni people and the Abacha military dictatorship. They claimed they practiced quiet diplomacy to try and save Saro-Wiwa, but that their interference would have been inappropriate. The evidence, as presented in the Wiwa v. Shell lawsuit and chronicled by groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, paints a far more sinister picture. This narrative suggests that Shell, furious at the Mossop protests that had cost them their Ogoniland profits, had moved from partner of the state to handler of the state. The allegations, which Shell continues to deny, are specific. They allege that Shell provided logistical and material support to the Nigerian military's internal security task force. The kill-and-go unit that terrorized the Ogoni witnesses testified that Shell-branded vehicles were used by this unit to raid villages. Internal company memos, leaked to the press, allegedly show Shell executives sharing security intelligence about Ken Saro-Wiwa's subversive movements directly with the military government, effectively painting a target on his back. The most damning allegation, which came from witnesses in the Wiwa trial, was that Shell representatives had been present at the military briefings where the Ogoni problem was discussed, and even more shockingly, had been present when cash bribes were offered to the fake witnesses who would later testify against Saro-Wiwa at his sham military tribunal. In this version of the story, Shell's silence in 1995, their refusal to use their immense economic power to stop the execution, was not diplomacy. It was collusion. It was the final quiet signature on a death warrant they had helped to write. This conspiracy theory that Shell actively participated in the judicial murder of a peaceful activist is the foundation of the modern boycott Shell movement. This narrative of shadow power extends far beyond Nigeria. There are persistent, though less documented, rumors of the dynasty's dark past. Some historians, like those cited by Marxist.org, point to the 1950s CIAM-I6 backed coup in Iran that overthrew the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh's crime was his plan to nationalize Iran's oil fields, which were controlled by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Shell's partner in the Seven Sisters cartel, the coup, which reinstalled the Shah, was a joint intelligence operation, but one, critics allege, that was heavily lobbied for and benefited from by the oil dynasties, including Shell. These theories, whether proven or not, all point to the same uncomfortable truth. The real power of the Shell dynasty was not a secret cloak and dagger conspiracy. It was, and is, the business model itself. The Shell system was a perfection of the revolving door that other dynasties like Bechtel had pioneered. The company did not need to bribe every official. It simply hired them. It embedded itself so deeply within the governments of the world that the line between corporate interest and national interest simply and conveniently disappeared. This is the soft power that defines their modern influence. While the public is focused on the hard power of oil spills and executions, Shell is waging a far more effective and more subtle war in the halls of Brussels, London, and Washington, D.C. The company spends millions of dollars every year on an army of lobbyists. Their job, as detailed by the EU Transparency Register and the U.S. Center for Responsive Politics, is to fight, weaken, and delay any meaningful climate change legislation. They lobby to protect their massive subsidies for fossil fuels. They lobby to ensure that any environmental law is filled with loopholes for carbon capture and natural gas. Their soft power is also academic. The dynasty, through the Shell Foundation and its massive corporate research budget, funds climate and energy research at the world's most prestigious universities, including MIT. This is, critics argue, a deeply cynical strategy. It allows Shell to greenwash its reputation, associating its logo with clean energy research. It allows them to co-opt the conversation, steering academic research away from stop drilling and towards technological solutions that Shell itself can profit from. And most importantly, it allows them to poach the next generation of brilliant scientists, offering them massive salaries to come and work on clean energy for the world's largest polluter. This, then, is the final verdict on the Royal Dutch Shell dynasty. The conspiracy theories that Shell is a secret cabal that murders its enemies are, as historians at Global Witness have pointed out, largely a distraction. The real scandal is not hidden. It is written in plain sight in their own court documents and financial reports. The $1.1 billion payment for the OPL 245 oil block in Nigeria was not a conspiracy. It was, as the Italian prosecutors laid out, a documented bribe funneled through a corrupt government to a shell company. The 2021 Dutch court ruling was not a conspiracy. It was the proven fact that the parent company in The Hague was legally responsible for the poisoning of Nigerian farms. The dynasty's true crime is not a single act. It is the system itself. The legacy of Marcus Samuel and Henri de Terding is a 120-year-old corporate family that has perfected the art of privatizing profit and socializing cost. They privatized the profits from the Niger Delta, extracting tens of billions of dollars. They socialize the cost, leaving the Nigerian people with a $100 billion environmental cleanup bill, a legacy of cancer, and a nation hollowed out by the very corruption the oil money fueled. The dynasty in the end has no blood. It has no family to feel shame. It is a machine. The legacy of the Shell family is a profound and ongoing lesson in the complex, unaccountable power of the modern multinational corporation. A dynasty that will, critics charge, willingly poison a continent to fuel the world and then use the profits to buy its own clean, green alibi.